Arjun Gupta is our keynote speaker, and I was so honored to have met Arjun. I met him when I was in Rome, when Telluride and Aspen and Western were putting together with Alberto this mountain resilience coalition, and Arjun was kind enough to buy us dinner. Right? When someone offers to buy you dinner in Rome, you say yes. Yeah. And he has such a diverse background. He's a mountain ambassador for the United Nations, but his main background, in addition to his love of mountains, is in tech. And he's going to talk about it tonight. He's a chief believer. I want that title. Can I steal your title? It's capital C, capital B. He's a chief believer at Telesoft Partners, a special situations venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. Over the last 25 years, Arjun has invested in and helped build over 100 technology companies, of which over 55 companies have been acquired or gone public. In 2001, this is where we get into his charitable efforts and his generosity. He launched a family foundation to support education, conservation, and the performing arts. And the foundation has supported over 100 projects all over the world. He has skied. Now he's got some street cred with this room, right? He has skied to the North Pole and to the South Pole, right? And was most recently appointed a UN Mountain Partnership Ambassador to help with climate change initiatives. And so we're so honored to have Arjun here tonight. He's going to help us with the following question. What can mountain movements learn from Silicon Valley? Let's give a warm welcome to Arjun.
So first, thanks very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I've never been to Gunnison before, so it was an absolutely extraordinary trip from Denver Airport coming out here. And let me first just introduce, I think Karinja's here, right?
Yes.
There she is. So she's really started this whole journey that brought John and me together, which is kind of culminated here this evening. But I'm frankly pretty blown away by this whole evening. I didn't really know what I was getting into when John first called me and said, "Hey, would I come across here?" And I flew in at noon to Denver Airport, and I had a car bring me here, and then I had to be on a conference call, and I was pulling some notes together for tonight. And then John came and brought me, and we took a walk across from my hotel to the campus. It was just extraordinary to just be back on a campus. You see the dorms and the apartments and the main classrooms. And then I come in here, and it starts off with the absolutely extraordinary poem, followed by the extraordinary donor who's sponsoring all the initiatives, and finally that movie. That's just like unbelievable. So I can't really follow that act, but I'll try and give you a few things that I've learned along the way, and maybe they'll help set something. So first, this is not really a presentation, but it's an active discussion. All I'm going to share is some of the reasons why I do what I do, and some of the lessons learned from Silicon Valley as John requested. But it's really a call to action. I think we are in an extraordinarily tough situation right now, and there are huge challenges. But the good news is, I think this is the greatest country in the world, and it will figure it out. So it's just a question of all of us kind of banding together and getting enough momentum behind specific initiatives to get it going. So let me kind of take a step back and say why mountains at all, and what is my involvement with the mountains. So I grew up in India. I'm 58 years old. The first 19 were in India, and then I got a scholarship to something called Washington State University. No one from my family had ever been to America. Probably many like whoever went on that in this movie had probably never been to India before. So the only Washington we knew about was Washington, D.C. So I thought I was going to D.C., but I ended up in Pullman, Washington. But welcome to America. It was all good. But I grew up in India. My mother and my sister are both English teachers. They actually teach at the American. There's a lot of like bizarre karmic kind of gizmos going on here. But in any case, my mother and sister teach at the American School in New Delhi. So they essentially teach English to American kids. And then fast forward in my life, I end up coming to the States, and I end up becoming an American citizen and settling here. So I think this whole notion of America and India theme is kind of giving me some karmic energy. I'm not sure where it's going. But in any case, as I was growing up, I went to a very strict boarding school. It was a military boarding school. It was the kind of place where in the middle of winter, you had to have cold water showers in the morning. And from 5:30 in the morning till 9:30 at night, which is from the minute you woke up till when you went to bed, there was a regimen. You were supposed to be doing something or the other at every single minute of the day. So by definition, if you weren't doing something, you were breaking the rules. But the founder and the principal was very much into the outward bound movement. And it was in India, the schools were gender-based. So I went to a boys' boarding school, my sister went to a girls' boarding school. But in any case, he really completely hammered into us the whole notion of how much the mountains and the outdoors can teach you. And every single time we'd go out into the mountains, it was absolutely spectacular. Beautiful places, hiking, getting to know each other, etc. So fast forward, I ended up coming back to New Delhi for college, and I started becoming a liaison officer with Himalayan expeditions, very large peaks over 20,000 feet. And that completely changed things. So a typical Himalayan expedition is probably about 6 weeks. You have a team of porters, or maybe 50 porters, and you go, you kind of work hard, hide, and you sleep low. You're acclimatizing. So you set up a base camp, you set up a camp, you kind of stalk it, you come back, sleep low. Clearly the oxygen at the low altitudes is you have more oxygen. And then you keep doing that until the 7th day to get to the main peak. Well, as I look back at life, the mountains really taught me almost everything I know. It taught me self-confidence, it taught me team spirit. They obviously taught me how to stand up on your own 2 feet, how to set serious goals. The logistics of a Himalayan expedition are extraordinary. Managing those 50 porters, making sure that you buy every single thing that you might need for the following 6 weeks, anticipating what kind of problems you may have medically and having supplies for that. So the logistics are very, very challenging. And it kind of really brought home to me that the mountains themselves are pretty much a paradigm for life. And that was where my love for the mountains first started. So why am I working with mountains now? Clearly, as I started kind of, I evolved in my career, and I had to decide which areas I would work on and where to focus on. Really, we got very deeply involved in a project called the Third Pole Initiative. So, if you take I'm going to abstract a few things and oversimplify them, but if you take the world, you've got the North Pole and the South Pole, which is kind of the XY dimension. But if you take the Z dimension, the third dimension, Everest would be the point that's closest to the sun from the surface of the Earth. Well, if the North Pole or the South Pole melt, which potentially they would because of climate change, essentially what's going to happen is sea levels are going to rise. Approximately 80% of the world's population are all within 20 miles of a coast. So they'll rise. And by the way, I'm not at all suggesting this is going to happen, and I'm also not suggesting that I'm oversimplifying things. But if that happened, you'd essentially see all the coastal communities move inwards. It'll be horrible. There'll be extraordinary destruction of property, but you can still manage. Now take the Z dimension and the Himalayan glaciers. That region goes Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Vietnam, etc., Cambodia, China, and then Bangladesh. So there's about 13 countries there, about 1.5 million people who are dependent on those glaciers for the fresh water. You cannot move 1.5 billion people. It will be the single largest catastrophe known to man. So what we're doing under the auspices of the President of Iceland is we're studying for, first we're just trying to create a fact base. How quickly or how slowly are these glaciers receding? The second, hopefully once we have collected the data, is to really work on solutions, which would be how can you store water? And as all of us know, the water storage technology hasn't really changed in 400 years. It's still kind of back in the Roman times where you create natural dams and you try and use gravity-fed systems to distribute the water downstream. But almost all of the systems, when you actually study them, you can't really buffer water for more than 2, maybe 3 years. So this is a very large open question, which is still kind of out there. But I got very involved with that project. It has started something called the Himalayan Glacial Institute in India. We are studying a few different glaciers and how quickly or how slowly they may be receding. But the most important thing it did was it created a kind of a format for all these different countries to cooperate, many of whom don't even speak to each other. So for example, India and Pakistan, both nuclear powers have skirmishes all the time. They don't tend to cooperate on a lot of things. But over here, with this situation of fresh water and their water supplies for the future, all that whole region is started at a governmental level, have started working together. So, that whole project started teaching me first, frankly, mountains are at the very center of the ecosystems, right? Of the natural ecosystem. Fresh water, none of us can survive without it. As John's statistics showed, something like 80% of the world's freshwater supplies come out of the glacier. If you look at certain kind of, they also start almost suggesting, you kind of sit there and say, or at least as a child, I used to sit there and say, why would China want to take over Tibet? It's an arid place. There's no minerals that are known to man. But 8 of the 10 largest rivers in that region come out of the Tibetan plateau. So they were way ahead of the game to really realize that, listen, our future depends on who owns those glaciers and those sources of water. Obviously, mountains as a whole, whether it's leisure, I split time between San Francisco and Silicon Valley and Aspen. But whether you take leisure, whether you take obviously all of natural resources, there's just absolutely food systems. There's all these core parts of the planetary systems and the natural world that are driven by our mountain communities. So I'm going to now, so that's kind of background as how I got involved. But as I was getting prepared and John asked me this question, I started thinking about, okay, what are the lessons learned from Silicon Valley that we can apply to this whole movement? So first, just to take a step back, I've been involved with the Natural Resources Defense Council for about 10 years, on climate change and all the issues associated with it. Of course, all of us now know if we want to go with the vast majority of the scientists, we kind of know what a large looming crisis that is. I think in the last decade, I can pretty strongly say this, for the first time, I think there's a level of awareness and a real momentum that's coming up from a grassroots level upwards, where government folks, policy decision makers, regulators, as well as heads of companies, as well as the average citizen, is starting to realize, hey, this is really going to change the way things happen, and we got to do something about it. So, what do I think about Silicon Valley, and how would I look at lessons learned? First, if you take a step back, Silicon Valley actually started from academia. Stanford was the middle of the ecosystem, and Xerox PARC, and so I think we have to take lessons out of that. I think a lot of these things, even though you may think each individual project maybe just a small project, but in aggregate, I think we will see that institutions like your own and others can play an extraordinary role in that. Second is timing. Silicon Valley didn't happen overnight. I've clearly been part of it for 40 years. But actually, if you take a step back and say, when IBM started in 1910, I think it was 1911. And then, of course, 40 years later, let's say in 1960, or 50 years later, you had the integrated circuit. And that created the whole kind of movement towards PCs. And then in 1980, another 40 years later, you had the PC appear. And now by 2020, you're really talking about everything from wireless to the internet and all of technology as we see it. But my point is, when you take a step back, that's a 100-year movement. It took a century to get from when IBM started to where we are today. So we, as we think about things, and we sometimes get depressed about maybe things not moving quite as fast as we want them to be, I think we have to kind of take into perspective, this is going to be a very long fight. We have to kind of think about it like a marathon and pace ourselves to kind of go the distance. Big breakthroughs. Silicon Valley really doesn't know the meaning of failure. I was shocked to see when people in Silicon Valley do a startup, even me as a venture capitalist, so I'm losing money in a deal where the company has to fall apart. But if they've tried hard, people are cheering you on for trying valiantly, and people will back you, and you'll take a little downtime, and then you go out there and start another company, and you'll go for it. And I think that's the kind of resilience that we need in this movement as we kind of go forward and build momentum. Third, the whole notion of precedents. So most of us are using iPads today, but if you really look back, 20 years ago, Apple had something called the Apple Newton, which was the true precedent of an iPad today, right? It was a device that had handwriting recognition, it was mobile and everything else, except cellular networks weren't around, certainly the level of content wasn't around, but it really took 20 years from the first precedent to come through to something that's en masse and is all over the place. Failure, we talked a little bit about failure. Noise, there's a lot of people who are going to say that this can't be done. Silicon Valley just doesn't listen to that. There's one person, I don't know, the world has 7 billion people, but one guy will come up with the idea and say, I'm going to make it happen. And then they'll get a team, and they'll write a plan, and they'll be wrong, and they'll reiterate, and step back, keep at it again and again and again until they get it right. We talked a little bit about timing and momentum. I do think this whole notion of conservation, the environment, and the extraordinary impacts it could have is finally getting awareness at a broad level, where the whole movement will actually start seeing certain results. We talked about mountain ecosystem. The whole of Silicon Valley is an ecosystem. No company can survive on its own, and the ecosystems are complicated. It's capital, it's people, it's the university and academic institutions, it's the research centers, it's the lawyers saying, hey, we'll write your first set of documents without charging you, and we'll delay charging you till you're successful. It's the landlords saying, we'll give you free space until you're for warrants, and we'll get paid down the line when you're successful. So you suddenly start seeing, as momentum picks up, you start seeing ecosystems. And I think this UN Mountain Partnership, Karina and I have many debates on whether it'll go anywhere or not. But I do feel that they're pulling together this extraordinary international ecosystem where you can't really predict where and when success will happen and at what levels. But things will happen, they'll build on themselves, and the entire ecosystem is going to kind of move forward. Okay, so the formula. What is the formula? I think it's pretty simple. The Silicon Valley formula is all about people. Human resources is most important. Give a bunch of capital to people who have great ideas, and then get out of the way. But it's ideas, people, and a certain amount of capital. However, the greatest companies have taken very small amounts of capital. It's absolutely insane. The companies that raise extraordinary amounts of capital, invariably something goes wrong. When they kind of assume extraordinary success, maybe they get arrogant, maybe they're not as hungry, something tends to go wrong. But I don't think capital is the thing that drives the answer. It's really the quality of the ideas and the human resource and the persistence to kind of keep at it. And I guess the last comment I'd make is what I see in Silicon Valley is just absolutely extraordinary focus. People, they don't take no for an answer. They don't just because 50 people are saying no and one person is saying yes, doesn't mean that you give up. You just kind of stick to it, right? And I'll give you an example. There's a company called Qualcomm, which most of you probably know in wireless. I wrote the business plan for them. But the entire telecom and wireless industry in America had decided to go with a digital standard called TDMA. It doesn't matter what it is. It's called time division multiplexing. But the entire industry, so everyone was building equipment for it, everyone was saying how they're going to deploy it, etc. Two guys in the entire planet, Dr. Urban Jacobs and Dr. Andrew Viterbi, two guys in San Diego, said, no, that's the wrong answer. They said, if we have digital wireless, no matter how much capacity we have, it won't be sufficient. So they're taking on the entire US industry with an established standard saying that's the wrong answer. The two guys find one guy who was the CTO of Pactel Cellular in California and explained to him that this is what our reasoning is and it'll never be enough. Craig Farrow, who was the CTO, finally so literally in a planet of 6 billion people, two guys are saying Everyone's wrong. One guy gets convinced, he says, well, I'll give you a shot. And they do a pilot. And of course, that leads to where I was headed, which is, the CDMA becomes the international standard. Korea adopts it, the US adopts it, India adopts it, and it just takes off like a rocket. So I think, I don't want to dwell too much on a single massive success or anything, but I do think that focus and not taking no for an answer is a very critical, fundamental, it's built into the DNA of Silicon Valley. I see you coming up. Would you like to join me here?
Yeah,
Come
so
on up.
let's thank Arjun for his opening comments. So Arjun had the idea that he pointed out that something happens to the brain after about a 30-minute lecture, right? And he thought it'd be nice to shift things for you and turn it into something more conversational. I believe we have somebody with a microphone for audience questions. Dave, is that correct?
Yeah, that's me.
That's you, all right. So maybe, wonderful. So I'll open with some questions. And Arjun, I know that was a really outstanding summary, of some of the innovative advantages that have emerged from Silicon Valley in such a short period of time. Could you help review some of that through connecting a couple of, let's say, 3 of the lessons learned from Silicon Valley in general and apply them specifically to mountain movements? So which of those, you talked about persistence, you talked about failure, you talked about the avoidance of monopolies, you talked about a number of things, but which of those lessons in general from Silicon Valley are most vital now? Say choose 2 or 3 for mountains.
I'd say the top 3 for me is 1, building ecosystems. None of us can do it alone. And this problem is way too complicated, and it has way too many stakeholders and too many constituencies, right? So you have, quote unquote, people who have economic reasons to basically do stuff that many of us don't want them to do. The people who have mining rights, people who have water rights, all kinds of things like that. Second is you have to get the governments and regulators involved. So I would say building ecosystems is extraordinarily important. The second one I'd probably put right up there is precedents, which is tiny little projects and tiny programs take off. Even the example you just showed today. 10 years later, there's probably going to be 50 villages doing what you've done, right? So the notion of building and precedents and building momentum, one on top of the other, is again extraordinarily important. And then the third one I'd put is probably the formula, which is ideas, money, and people. But it's all about the people. And a lot of that starts with young people and academic institutions like universities, where they want to do something, they take a project, they see early success, then they build on it. Generations of students that come after with professors like you kind of build on past successes and keep growing.
Yeah. And it strikes me that, I like the comparison with academia gives me some hope, that sometimes we all think of this as the ivory tower, right? And every now and then the student will say, yeah, we keep talking about these ideas, when are we going to do something? And just to know that, in academia, the research centers of the Stanford area really resulted in a fundamental change in how our species will ever communicate with each other again forever.
Exactly right.
I guess one of my questions for you is, do we have to be careful with that analogy? So, in other words, is there something particularly complex about the wicked problems of climate change in mountains that's fundamentally different from tech development, where you find a brilliant idea, you find a venture capitalist willing to take a risk, and you see if you can cross that tipping point? Is there something fundamentally different about mountain communities that holds you back from drawing a perfect analogy between the acceleration of Silicon Valley change?
That's a good point. I mean, it certainly isn't a perfect analogy. I think what I would look at is for a movement of this size and having impact over long periods of time, let's say multiple centuries, what are the parameters that you look at which would be similar, right? So financial resilience, organizationally, how are we going to organize to make things happen? And that would outlive any of us individually, but the movement keeps going for long periods of time. The notion of breakthroughs, someone or the other is going to come out with a significant breakthrough. I have my bet on, frankly, if you haven't seen them, do look them up. But the solar tiles that Elon Musk's company has made, I mean, they're gorgeous. It would be like looking at the apple for the first time. They look great. They look almost identical to a roof as we build them and as we used to. and he's putting in an entire battery pack. You know, most houses have a garage, so the wall at the end of the garage would basically be a battery pack. I think that's a huge breakthrough. We haven't seen enough of it in the press. It hasn't been deployed yet, but I even have a friend who just deployed it, and they are completely energy neutral.
Going off of breakthroughs, and I'd like for the audience to start thinking of their questions as I'm working through this last one. I'm going to draw a couple analogies here. Thinking about breakthroughs, you know, to me, tipping points are a great mystery. You know, the point at which you go from 10, 11, 12% of a community fighting for something to where it tips to where it's just, that's the way society's going to be. Ben Franklin, for example, predicted only a third of Americans were for independence in 1776, yet there was a tipping point. Barack Obama, when running for president in 2008, had he supported gay marriage in 2008, it would have been political suicide in the primary. Had he not supported it in 2012, it would have been political suicide. Something happened in those 4 years. It was a tipping point around gay marriage. And another one I would offer is all of you have phones in your pockets, right? And you know, just to think through that when you think about Steve Jobs, or you think about Hewlett-Packard, you think about Facebook starting from a dormitory, Hewlett-Packard starting from a garage, Apple starting from a garage. These things seem so unlikely in the moment of the garage, and then they change how we communicate forever. In your pocket is everything your species has known, and it's searchable, and you can connect with pretty much any member of that species, like that. And 20 years ago, that wasn't possible, and it started in a garage. So a couple questions for you. What are the garages of this movement for mountains, and how do we start to look for and support tipping points?
So a couple of things, as John, as you were speaking, it was striking me. First is we've all got very used to instant gratification, right? We want fast answers. And that's why I was trying to give the analogy of the computer revolution. It's taken 100 years. Just to quantify some of the things you were saying, Apple and Microsoft went public right around 1980. But back then, it was a bunch of geeks using computers, right? And so, when did the tipping point happen? I don't know, probably 20 years later. Mm-hmm. So, I think these things have to build on themselves first. But sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. Where I was headed was, people forget, but there was Simpson Bowles, which almost went through. The week of when the US would have had a carbon tax. Was that Simpson Bowles, or was it, I may have got that wrong, which is 2 senators, but it was bipartisan. The vote on the carbon tax was going to go through the week of September 11th, right? So I think there are all these precedents that I see where I think that now clearly there are different administrations that come in, there's, the momentum goes one way or the other, and we'll have to deal with that. But I do think that there's, the tipping point is close. I can't really, none of us have a crystal ball to exactly say when it is, but I think there's enough problems and there's enough awareness of this now where we are pretty close to things happening, is my guess.
Our students have shown our present administration that solar is starting to outcompete coal. Mm-hmm. There are barriers to getting that done that are political, outside of the campus's control, but they're working hard at that. So there's some tipping points economically. We're starting to see movements, right, pushing, especially out of this generation, for climate action. But I'm still curious, when you think about Silicon Valley going from garages and dorm rooms to changing how we communicate forever. Yeah. What do you look around, you travel the world, you're a leader in the United Nations Mountain Partnership, you see grassroots movements in San Francisco, Aspen, you're learning about us. Where do you see the garages, if you will?
I think you got to start a garage.
We got a garage here?
You got the garage here.
What do you think of that?
We got to create in Colorado, and right here in Gunnison.
All right, all flattery aside.
John's going to start the garage for the climate.
I need my name in cursive right here.
Mountain Resilient. And, it took a lot of garages, all working. Have you guys heard about the 1,000 monkey theory?
Writing Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's like all people doing stuff all over the. But if 1,000 people do the same thing, no matter where they are, it gets to what he's calling the tipping point, right? So you need a lot of garages, but it's happening. By the way, I just remembered Simpson Bowles. I misquoted. That was the bipartisan effort on taxes. But the one I was thinking about for the carbon tax was Markman Waxley, right? And that came so close. So, from my perspective, those garages are happening. Your school, Jake's movie, from here, between Gunnison and what is the name of the village? Yeah, that's a garage. That's a great example of a garage happening, right? And so, but these two things, the fact that the United States could think of a carbon tax, all the way up to almost getting a vote in Congress, that's huge. We can't underestimate that. Yes, things happened. Yes, the 08, correction occurred, etc. So other agendas took more importance. But that is huge. The whole Elon Musk style thing is huge. So if we have enough garages with small ideas, just doing their thing, get into the 1,000 monkeys, and have the regulators trying to at least get a framework of what could happen or how they may address it. And then you have a couple big breakthroughs. That's the formula for success.
I'm really glad to hear you say that. I want to see some hands going up for who's going to ask the next question. I figured it'd be Lauren and Honan, but while the microphone's going to Lauren, it's an observation and a point here. I appreciate you pointing out the garages, because folks, you think about the students, you think about your lifetime as adults. In 2009, and it's easy to give up on the big solutions and decide that success only looks like carbon neutrality by 2050, and anything short of that is failure, so why try? How many people have felt that way, right? Yeah, when you get at the garage level, so you've seen a major failure, in addition to the one you mentioned, 2009, right? You had an historic wave election for President Obama, a major majority in the House that passed a climate bill that was 17% reductions by 2020, and the Senate, again, was very close. John Kerry had Joe Lieberman and Lindsey Graham talking to get them to finally cross the line on a vote in the Senate, and the oil spill in the Gulf happened, and that scared off Lindsey Graham. And so, we've come so close so many times, but maybe part of the problem is that we think the solution is going to happen on that level. How many of you in this room, watch, this will be fun, how many of this room have read a book by Paul Hawken called Blessed Unrest? Yeah. And in that book, he counted how many cold harbors are out there, right? How many Save the Local River organizations are out there? He counted 2 million on the planet. He said this is the most successful social movement in the history of humanity. He said those 2 million organizations are the antibodies of the immune system of the earth. That's what it means to be a garage. I like antibodies better, right? And that's where it starts. And so let's not get overwhelmed that there's a lack of a big solution.
And sorry, just to add one other dimension. So we talked about, the garages, right?
Yeah.
Seed projects. We talked about the government and regulators hopefully getting enlightened and coming up with a reasonable framework in a reasonable time frame. And then we talked about massive breakthroughs, right? That could really change the world. But there's another one. For the first time, corporations are getting involved. Unilever has shown a multi-billion-dollar multinational, every country in the world, where they, I'm not sure how many people know this, but there's a Harvard case which you should use on Unilever. But the CEO there said, I'm going to do sustainable farming, tea and everything else. And everyone told him, your market share is going to go down. That was exactly the opposite. His market share went up and his market cap went up. Similarly, Salesforce, in San Francisco has this 1+1+1% model. Give up 1% of your time, 1% of the company's equity, and 1% of their profits to doing good things. And they are really taking their communities and allowing individual employees to take projects, again to your notion of garages, and whatever motivates an individual, just moving the ball forward one step at a time.
Very good. Lauren Honan has a question back there, and then someone's going to put their hand up so Dave can run to them after, so Chase can run to them after Lauren asks his. Go ahead, Lauren. Microphone. Mic check. Mic check.
I want to go back to that point, I guess, that you were just getting there, Arjun, and it's originally to your formula idea, the idea of people and capital, but it's all about the ideas in the first place, is that seems to me like a coaching formula in the tech industry.
Yeah.
Does it work in social capital, right? What about things where we're not expecting a fiscal return on investment? Is that same formula going to work?
I should hope so. I don't think I have a bad formulaic answer to your question, but I think both sides. First, I think you can use best practices from industry to say, what is this? How do you set goals? How do you measure impact? How do you even hold yourself accountable to doing? It doesn't have to be a monetary impact. It could be anything. If you're going to say you're going to plant a million trees, how are you going to hold yourself accountable and at what pace and what was the, right? So I do think that you can actually figure out ways to apply business principles of running a project and setting goals to doing it. I'll tell you where I've gone wrong, and I've seen many people go wrong, is if the ideas are overly generic or they're trying to make too far a leap. To your question, when you ask, some students only want to get to carbon neutral or nothing. That's where I think you can have a lot of problems. But if you kind of take a stepwise refinement approach and build, one on the other, maybe 10 generations from now, there will be a set of students who are saying, hey, the only answer we're going to take is carbon neutral because we're probably only 10% off carbon neutral by then, right?
Professor Yui has a question here. And after you ask your question, hand the microphone to Swift-Footed Chase so he can get the microphone across the room. Go ahead, Susan. I want you to start with, you have one. Wow, how did you do that? Did you just carry one around? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for coming tonight. This is really exciting. One of the things, so I teach, but I also run Cold Harbor Institute, and one of the ways we have approached this is that we as in the organization doesn't do anything. We facilitate other people's work, and the way we facilitate that is in essence an incubator for work in those areas. And my question to you is that one of the really important things that we have felt all along is to work with our people to be really entrepreneurial. So all of our students develop essentially businesses, enterprises, and they can be for money, different currencies, sure, but definitely enterprises. And so in this time right now, nonprofits are having a hell of a time. There is no real government money, and there isn't a lot of incentive for private donations, and so it's really tough. And one of the things we've really tried to do is build earned income streams for us. And it's hard because doing all of those things together, sure, becomes complex. And so when you say do one thing at a time, how would you approach that? I mean, it's a whole different world. I've run, yeah, nonprofits before, and this is really exciting because we really are facilitating, but it's challenging.
And you don't want to tell Suzanne to do one thing at a time.
Yeah. No, by the way, if I said that, I said it wrong, because I do believe in parallel processing. You can't wait. It would take forever to just do one thing at a time, right? But what I think I would caution us is you do want stepwise refinement. You want to build on what other people have done so that as a whole, the whole ecosystem, is moving up and forward. So how would I approach this? I think I'd probably take two ends of the barbell. The first is I do think seed funding on tiny projects and making sure something works is a great idea. The proverbial garage. And I think, what do you think a garage would cost? If you wanted to do a little lab here.
I priced out a garage recently.
Okay, tell me.
Well, is an apartment on top or
yeah,
not? With the apartment on top, $150,000. Let's go with 70 for a basic garage.
Okay, I'll give you $150,000.
Right now?
Right now.
Let's do this.
Okay. So we'll start a garage now, and we'll run an experiment. Let's see where
Free
it goes.
home for my brother.
Yeah, there you go. So we will run a seed fund for ideas. Let the students come up with great ideas, and you guys pick. Like the movie we just saw. What do you think works? And let's try and make it an example to give the metrics that the gentleman asked the question about, that can show business people, here are the metrics, we created X number of schools, we planted Y number of trees, we graduated Z number of students, whatever it is, or gallons of fresh water, clean water. I think there was a little example there of maybe not so clean water being used, etc. So I think that's one end. The other end is you have to partner with the people whose entire livelihood is at stake, and I don't mean individuals, I mean big corporations. So if there's climate change, guys, there's no snow, guess whose lunch gets eaten? The ski resorts. So we have to get the Aspen Ski Company, Vail Resort, all these massive ski operation to work. Now I haven't seen this kind of example before, so I think the corporates are going to say is academic is funding something at a university, highly academic, and it will not be applied. As long as applied innovation, I think you will find a lot of people supporting you. I'm not saying it will be easy. I'm not saying it won't be hard. I'm not saying it won't be your sixth job, but
Well, let's get some student voices into this. Ethan, go ahead.
Thank you for speaking tonight. I'm curious, you are both a venture capitalist and a goodwill ambassador of a government organization. If we simplify our world perhaps to,
Raise your hand.
Oh, yeah, thank
to
you.
commerce, to government organizations, and to non-government organizations, where do you see the lead against climate change coming from, and where as environmental practitioners would we be best to put our efforts?
Okay, so just so you have the whole picture before you start thinking I'm some crazy venture capitalist. I came to America with $2,000. If I could do it in this country, anyone can do it. Believe me. And the American dream, as far as I'm concerned, is right there. It's super strong, and this country will figure out answers, right? So now, with respect to to your question about, did I understand it right? You're saying which portions are going to drive the momentum behind the climate change solutions, right? This problem is so hard and it's so interlinked that I don't think you can get any individual group to deliver. If you could somehow have, if I was going to use a magic wand and say, if I had only one group to pick, who would I pick? It would obviously be the regulators. You put on a carbon tax, boom, it's done. But as you've seen with the European example and various other places, carbon taxes haven't worked that well. The theory was very different than what happened in the market, right? So I would say the four most important pieces are the regulators, policy decision makers, the NGOs, NRDC, where I'm still involved there, but I was on the board for a fair amount of time. They have a critical role. They're taking polluters to court. They're going and getting new standards set in California because you have a regime that treats it as very important, and then that gets fanned out over the rest of the country, and then after America, everyone else follows. And so it's this whole, again, on the notion of cycles and momentum, it builds up. So in the NGOs, whether it's a CI, whether it's a NRDC, but some of these really focused big nonprofits are unbelievably important. The corporates, as I said, they're only just starting, but I do see the large, when you have someone like Unilever, which is at scale, and then you have, again, it's the ecosystem working, then Harvard Business School writes a case on it. Then guess what? 800 MBAs at Harvard Business School read that case, and then every other business school is teaching, or some percentage of every business school is teaching that case. More and more people suddenly start having the idea, hey, this
That's
could
the
work.
ecosystem. That's the ecosystem.
That's the ecosystem at work. Exactly, it's a great example of the ecosystem working. So I don't think the problem is way too complicated and too interdependent on all these different constituents. Now, we took examples only of people who are on our side wanting to change. Remember, there's this enormous, ginormous tsunami of people who want the status quo. They want it to remain as it is, whether it's mineral rights, whether it's, and by the way, I don't want to be political here, but many people think that China is helping Africa to go again after mineral rights, right? So there's all kinds of things, this is a fact, this is not picking on anyone. If the North Pole, the ice cap melts, there's only one country in the world that will get a significant economic advantage. That's China. because it's, and I'm not sure the exact math, but you can probably do the analysis. People have analyzed that the transportation cost in North America will be down by between 15 and 30%. So there are all these weird interlinkages and how different people look at things with different lenses, given what their agenda is, which is why I keep thinking that it's way too complicated for any single group to drive the answer. Does that make sense?
Yes, please, Leslie. You can take my microphone.
So on that thought, how do we approach certain corporations to become more sustainable or redesign their systems?
Or even the larger economic system in which they've functioned since they've been considered persons over 100 years ago. But we won't get there yet. We will. Start with the...
I don't think I have a formulaic answer, because if there was a formula, people would have applied it and seen success. I think in corporations, there's a lot to be said about the DNA and the values of a company. And that starts with the beliefs, or at least I believe it starts from the beliefs of the CEO, whether it's a man or a woman. They have to truly believe. If they believe, the entire organization tends to follow. And then you do a few experiments, they do well, people get confident, they see positive reinforcement, then you do more and more and more. So in the case of the two that I told you, Salesforce, it's purely driven by Mark Benioff, the CEO and founder. I invested in him, so I know that whole example very well. I don't know what got Paul Pullman from Unilever to start, but at some point in time, it kind of changed. Now, what beyond the CEO, what else can we do? Well, clearly things like LEED Platinum and just doing environmentally rational building and construction. I have a tough time believing why any successful CEO wouldn't believe in that, right? So there's certain segments of solutions that we should just be getting, whether it's our public servants, the people that we vote for, but getting that on the agenda is unbelievably important. We all are voting every single day with our dollars, and so supporting companies that actually do the right thing and boycotting companies that do the wrong thing, I think makes a lot of sense. So I don't think that, again, there's no single answer to say how will you go en masse. I think we are in the early stages of companies realizing, and to take a step back for a second, Salesforce will tell you that their retention, in Silicon Valley, there's ginormous competition to get the best engineers, to get the best marketing, salespeople, etc., and everyone has multiple offers. So retention of those human resources is a very, very expensive and very important activity of any company. So Salesforce is being able to show that because of their culture, the people who come there stay there longer. So the company is even getting economic benefit out of doing the right thing. So of course you probably saw and you probably heard the homeless problem in San Francisco is reaching, it's like really sad and it's really epic proportion. So again, Mark has now put a tax on the ballot, which actually passed, which is going to be a certain amount of, I think it's a small percentage, I forget the percentage, but it's a certain percentage tax from all companies that will just go to help solve the homeless problem. So whether it's taxation, whether it's leadership, whether it's voting with our dollars, whether it is ensuring that our representatives force companies to do the right thing, I think all of that will build momentum. Does that make sense?
I wonder, please, we have a question in the center of the room. Is that Maria?
Yes.
Hi, Maria. Did you just get back from Amsterdam?
Yes, I did. Quick question. I was just wondering if you have any advice for young professionals entering the marketplace on how to better communicate their ideas to gain credibility from investors, and what it really takes to make people believe in them, and how they can just really represent themselves well, and just tips on entering the marketplace and representing yourself as professionally as possible.
You mean for a business plan or for an individual?
A businessman and just an individual who's leading that business plan, just to gain credibility. What are some key things you've seen people do, or just some success?
And Maria, do you mean like in the context of sustainability, where it's so easy to quickly lose credibility and people think you're sort of making the usual environmental arguments?
goals, sustainability initiatives, what can you do to rise above and be different and just kind of differentiate yourself?
So hold your environmental values, but still build credibility with new audiences.
So I think in the nonprofit sector, we have a fundamental challenge, right? So supposing, I'm exaggerating, but supposing you're the 100th Save the World Foundation, it's kind of hard to really get credibility, right? People are going to say, what's different about you? How are you doing it? Supposing it's 3 people or 4 people, do you have scale? Where's your financial resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think the first thing to start out with, and I always say, kind of suggest this to entrepreneurial teams, whether in the for-profit or the non-profit sector, is what's different? What are you doing that someone else is not doing? Then on an individual basis, I think you have to show a record of over-delivering on your commitments. It doesn't matter whether it was school or whether it was, on a sports team or, extracurricular work. There are multiple ways by which you can show your initiative, and the fact that you're a focused human being that actually over-delivers on what, by the way, including a certain number of failures along the way, right? That's perfectly fine. But you have to say what's different. You have to get personal credibility from your story. And then what are you going to do and what are the metrics and milestones to see whether your idea is actually going to work? So if it doesn't work, you can actually pivot and do something else, right? And then lastly, as I said, what is the ecosystem that you're going to work within to kind of leverage other people and other resources to get momentum behind your idea and your initiative?
Well, and I noticed that the center of the arc you just gave us was failure.
Yeah.
Yeah?
I think failure teaches you a lot, and I think how you deal with it is very, very important. And I think, obviously I gave you the example of Silicon Valley where, as I said, I truly believe, if you failing valiantly, people are going to rally around you. Every sports team, no matter intramurals or anything else that you've played, you have to learn to kind of deal with failure. So I think there's many ways where you can make failure as an extraordinary driver. I'll tell you in my own story. I came with very little over here. In 1993, I'd finished my MBA and I'd worked at McKinsey for a while. I had $200,000 worth of savings. I'd never really failed in my life before, other than on climbing or whatever. But I mean, in a business context, I'd never failed. And I thought in America, I told you about the Qualcomm. We'd just written the business plan. It had gone public. It was a giant company, and I'm thinking, you know what? In America, you really can't fail. You just work really hard, and out comes the pot of gold on the other end of the tunnel. So I had $200,000, and I went to work for a venture capitalist called Kleiner Perkins, a very famous venture capital firm back there. And my model was very pure. I came up with an idea with them, and I put $100,000 of my own money behind it. And they put $100,000. And of course, we tried, and 6 months later, we had nothing, and we failed, completely failed. So I'm thinking, okay, that was like a tough start. God is really testing me or whatever. So we had another idea, and I had my remaining savings of $100,000. I put the second $100,000 in the second idea, matched by the venture capitalist. And of course, they had a $1 billion fund on which mine was like all my savings. And we failed again. And so in June of 1994, I couldn't pay rent. I couldn't put food on the table. I knew I had to go back to work. And so, of course, the core foundation I had was my degrees and my education. No one can take that away from me. So I called back my manager from McKinsey and I said, listen, I can't put food on the table. I need a job again. And this guy said, absolutely, you work really hard. We love you, come on back. But it was luckily, I think it was a Thursday. He said, hey, take the weekend off. You're sounding really stressed, like chill out and let's do breakfast on Monday. And I went for breakfast with him on Monday. And he said, you left for a reason. And I get it. You can't pay rent right now, so you really want to come back and all of that. But you left for a reason. What is your real passion? And use this time to really figure it out. And that's really hard to do when all the chips are down. You can't pay rent. But I kid you not, it was the best advice I could have ever gotten. And he picked up the phone and he called, there was a very famous financier those days called George Soros in New York. He's the largest hedge fund manager in the country. And he had just started a private equity firm. So, and my manager calls the head of that firm who had worked together, and he said, there's a young kid, he's worked really hard, he's in dire straits, he's tried a couple of companies, he's failed. Would you hire him? Just as an introduction. So the guy says, hey, come on over for an interview. I take a flight out there, and he talks to me the whole interview about the failures and what I learned. And at the end of it, he gave me a job. So I think, again, none of these there's no, again, formula or magic answer. I think you just have to, if you're going to do something, you got to be really honest about it. You got to dedicate yourself. You got to have a game plan that shows measurement of what you did and how you did it. You got to be pretty honest about your failures and what you learned about them. And then I think the world is really behind you and makes it happen.
Everybody get all that? That last part, that we recorded that. So that last list is really a nice barrage of advice for leading with failure. What an interesting phrase for y'all to kind of contemplate and chew on. I'll ask the last question. I'd ask everybody to look at their table. A one-pager was passed around. Flip over to kind of the map there. That's what we're launching tonight. That's Western's Center for Mountain Transitions. I'll give it to you in a minute there, Arjun. And those are all the skills I talked about. If your passion for mountains is in our backyard, if your passion for mountains is on UN level, we can give you access as a student. Please reach out to us. And I guess my question to Arjun is, here we are launching something, and how lucky is Western, let's hear it, how lucky is Western to have the UN Mountain Ambassador on the night that we're launching our Center for Mountain Transitions, huh? Offering.
And Corinda, who represents all of you every quarter and every month and every didn't you just come back from can you tell them about what?
Well, she'll be on the panel tomorrow.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
Yeah, no spoilers.
Okay, good.
She'll be on the panel tomorrow.
Okay, great.
And but I guess just in closing, y'all are the Center for Mountain Transitions, and so this is not just advice to me, the dean up here. You've started many ventures, You had one word of advice for us for our first step in really launching this. What would it be?
First, I'm full of hope for this area because I think we have finally arrived at critical mass of awareness of almost all the critical constituencies. Corporations, regulators, the average person, the NGOs, all coming together. Second is, I think you should really build on this theme of Colorado starting to become, or Gunnison becoming one of the garages and a true laboratory of new ideas that once they're test piloted can actually scale. So what I don't know enough about the movie and the actual project, but it seems like if that worked for one village, it's a concept and a blueprint that you can take, and you'll even be able to quantify the kind of financial resources you need, the kind of human resources you need. You could have a blueprint to take it to multiple other areas, right? But I think doing that would be some way for you to, one, differentiate. Two is you'll focus the students. Three, it'll be really, people are going to feel good about their achievements and the value they're adding. And then the third one I would say is probably, I think we should develop this theme of partnering with corporations that have the most to lose in this movement. So like the ones that come immediately to mind is obviously the ski companies, but also, I'm quite friendly with Schoenard at Patagonia, and he gives away 10% of his profits to great projects, and he's deeply in love with the mountain communities of pretty much all over, but in particular India, Nepal, and Pakistan. So I think we can even find some other additional ways to help scale this.
Brilliant. It's an honor to have you as a friend of the new center. Arjun Gupta. Thanks a lot. Beautiful. And remember tomorrow, 12:30, right here, we have our panel on Mountain Resilience Coalition. Alberto, Mr. Mayor, Carino, Pamela and Zoline, all sparked by a poem by our Good Times. Don't miss those mountain poets at 4 tomorrow in Kelly 116. One more huge round of applause for every great thing that happened tonight around mountains.